Cadash was a 4-player action role-playing arcade game released in 1989 by Taito. I always loved the game when I was a child, but I never made it that far due to the limited quarters and endless machines to play in the local arcade. Home console ports were released on the TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis in 1991 and 92 respectively. I was a sucker for a good home arcade port, so I'm not really sure why I never purchased Cadash to play from the comfort of my own couch. I'm not even sure if I even realized it had a home port, because I can't imagine not spending my allowance on it, given some of the horrible games I did buy. But recently I had the chance to give it a go again, and here's my review of the Sega Genesis port. Cadash on the Genesis is a side-scrolling action role-playing platform game that can handle 2 players at once. In the arcade, players could choose between a fighter, wizard, a priestess, and a ninja. Importing the game to Sega's console, Taito did away with the last 2, and only Conan and Gandalf, the fighter and wizard, are available to play with. The fighter can deal more damage but cannot use magic like the wizard. It's pretty typical stuff, even the cookie-cutter fantasy video game story. Nothing is particularly inspired, but the game itself is nicely executed and surprisingly original for an arcade game of the era. So how do you go about bringing back peace into the land? By killing everything in your way, of course. Gameplay is very similar to side-scrolling sections in Legend of Zelda 2. Players walk, jump, duck, attack, and level their way up through tons of enemies as they advance across the map and eventually fight a boss. Along the way, they will find inns to rest at and shops that sell weapons and armor upgrades, as well as potions and antidotes. The fighter has stronger attacks and can block projectiles, which is good, because that's pretty much all he has. The wizard cannot block, but starts with a basic fireball, and as he grows stronger gets access to flying daggers, an ice nova, and lightning, among other spells. The game claims the fighter is better for newer players, and makes the game easier, but the wizard is just so overpowered, I can't imagine that being true. At first, your limited magic points make it important for you to conserve casting, but once you've gained enough levels, you are far likelier to run out of hit points before using up all of your spells, and at that point, I would recommend just letting fire and fury rain down on everything that moves. If you die and rejuvenate, you get all of your magic points back anyway, so it doesn't make sense to be conservative at that point. Continues have a much higher premium in the Genesis version, so anything you can do to prolong your life is advised. Whether you play as the fighter or the wizard, it's a good idea to grind extra enemies to level up as much as possible. Immediately on stage 1 there's a good place to kill endless pigmen, and go up at least 4 or 5 levels before really getting started. Later in the game, I found the graveyard to be another good place to grind with the zombies that attack. Anywhere will work fine though, because the enemies will continue to respawn if you move back and forth along the path. Trust me, you'll need it because the game can be rather cheap, the bosses especially. Grinding enemies will also allow you to purchase as many items as you can carry, and all the equipment upgrades you come across. Returning to the previous inn is also a good tactic when faced with an imminent death, if you can make it back. The graphics and sound are pretty good for the Genesis, but it's not exactly arcade perfect, as some things like the cloud effects, shimmering torches, and certain frames of animation are all missing. It is, however, a close enough port that it feels and looks pretty faithful, minus the 2 missing characters. I prefer the wizard anyway, so I was fine with it, but if you like to choose the priestess or ninja, you're out of luck here. In that case, you could always go play the TurboGrafx version of the game, but that version feels far less faithful in terms of graphics and sound, as well as the core gameplay. I'll admit that having all 4 characters would have definitely added some more replayability, but I can also tell that Taito's development focus was on matching the level design and the overall feeling, and ultimately that's what matters most to me in a port. As far as the difficulty goes, none of the basic enemies are that hard when you know their attack patterns, but the game can be particularly cheap. But in general, they hit pretty hard, and even as you level up and gain more hit points, they persistently do more and more damage, so you never really feel like you gained an edge in that regard. Falling in water will continually damage you until you get a power-up from a mermaid, and certain platforming sections are designed to punish you with that fact. If you ever get poisoned and you don't have an antidote, prepare to die eventually because it does not seem to wear off. A couple of the bosses are relentless in their attacks, and two in particular didn't seem to have a proven strategy except hope for luck, or just power your way through. In the arcade game you can pop in another quarter, so like a lot of arcade games from that time period, Cadash is not designed to be mastered, but instead afforded. I understand that, but in the Genesis version you'll have limited continues, and that can be a real issue. The game doesn't seem to have been rebalanced to account for that, so the grinding and backtracking to an end from time to time are a necessity. Cadash is still a great deal of fun though, and contains an amount of depth not seen from many side-scrollers back then. If you have the option of playing the arcade game, of course I would recommend that, but if you find a copy on Genesis, or even partake of the occasional ROM, then I can vouch for its appeal if you like action RPGs, or arcadey side-scrollers. It doesn't take very long to beat, an hour or two maybe, but you aren't likely to beat it the first time through anyway. It would have been nice if Taito had included the missing two characters, because then you would have had one of the best 16-bit arcade ports available. It would have also been nice if the gameplay had been balanced better to account for the limited continues. But you can certainly do a lot worse. Final score, 76.